I'm Jeremy Scahill from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Israel is continuing to intensify its attacks across the Gaza Strip, just mercilessly bombing the Palestinians of Gaza. And this is happening as President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have launched this public messaging campaign to claim that a Gaza ceasefire deal may be on the horizon. In fact, just this morning, on Tuesday morning, Trump said that he believes that a ceasefire agreement could be reached as early as next week. Israeli Prime Minister and fugitive from international justice, Benjamin Netanyahu, confirmed today that he is going to be traveling to the United States this weekend, where he says he's going to be meeting with not only Trump administration officials, but also U.S. congressional leaders. Now, it's important to note that while Trump and Netanyahu and the Hebrew language press are filled with stories about how there are going to be developments on a Gaza ceasefire, Hamas officials, and I've spoken with them myself, say they've been told nothing, that there is no actual substantive developments, that they have not seen any new proposals. They continue to be in touch with mediators from the region, from Qatar and Egypt. In fact, there have been a flurry of meetings in Cairo that were generated because of Trump's announcements, but there are no direct or indirect talks right now happening with anyone from the United States. And, you know, Hamas is saying that it is open to hearing new ideas, but it is remaining very clear in its position that it is not going to sign a short-term deal. What's on the table as of May is 60 days. Roughly half of the Israeli captives that are believed to still be alive in Gaza would be exchanged for a larger number of Palestinian captives being held by Israel. But the real sticking point boils down to one key issue, and that is that Israel has insisted that it is not going to agree to a process that would lead to a permanent ceasefire or a long-term truce, which Hamas has proposed. In fact, Hamas has said that in return for a multi-year truce, that it would release all of the Israeli captives living and dead in Gaza in what Hamas has called an all-for-all deal. So none of the terms seem to have been changed at all. Hamas has not heard any new ideas. And if you read the Hebrew language press, what the Israeli narrative is that the United States needs to pressure Qatar, to pressure Hamas to effectively capitulate. And I think I can say with a lot of confidence, based on almost daily discussions with Palestinian negotiators, that's not going to happen. So if Trump wants to make a deal, and this is important to him, and that's a big if, then everyone knows what the terms need to look like. The Palestinian side is not going to sign a surrender agreement. It's not going to sign an agreement that allows for indefinite Israeli occupation. So a lot of moves are going to happen certainly in the coming days from the U.S. and Israeli side. The key question is, are Netanyahu and Trump actually talking about making an announcement that seeks to actually circumvent Hamas, which remains, as destroyed as Gaza is, the official governing body of Gaza? This is all happening as we've seen a series of really horrifying massacres take place. On Monday, Israel bombed a very popular Café in Gaza, where many journalists and others would go to access the internet, and the scenes coming out of that massacre are just utterly horrifying. We have just become accustomed for more than 20 months to seeing Palestinian bodies just shredded, and the world decreasingly paying any attention to this. To talk a little bit more about this, I'm joined by my colleague at Dropsite News, Sharif Abdel Kouddous. Sharif, nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Jeremy. And yeah, I think what we saw yesterday, this horrific attack, is part of a pattern that we've been seeing, of course, since the beginning of the genocide. But really, there's been an upswing in the level of genocidal violence over the past month. We've seen dozens of people being killed every day, many of them being killed in what's now termed aid massacres. That's become, a new term in the genocide lexicon, where starving Palestinians forced to go to militarized distribution hubs, or so-called aid distribution hubs, to try and get some food, are gunned down, shelled, attacked by Israeli forces, by mercenaries. And in barely over a month, 600 Palestinians have been killed, and that's a minimum figure. These are just the bodies that have passed through public hospitals and have been verified by the health ministry. Yesterday was a particularly bloody day, as you mentioned. At least 116 people were killed across Gaza in various aerial bombings. The Israeli military admitted today that its air force had struck 140 targets across Gaza. And the single deadliest strike of the day was, of course, the bombing of Albaka Café, which was a really prominent venue along the coastline of Gaza City. It somehow survived this 21 months of genocidal assault. It was a popular venue, especially because it did have internet, and it was a place journalists would gather as well. It was a place families would go to try and get some respite from the genocidal violence. The bombing and the ground attacks are usually more severe in the eastern side of the Gaza Strip, which is closer to the Israeli border and where Israeli troops are. And so people would come westward to the sea to try and get some respite. And this cafe was bombed actually while a children's birthday party was underway. And the footage that we got from an incredible journalist that we work with on the ground in Gaza City, Abdel, really shocking scenes. You can see the crater where the missile hit. It's obviously, they used quite a powerful munition. It's a very large crater. Nearly 40 people were killed. Many were wounded. Another journalist was killed, Ismail Abu Hatab, who was a photographer, photojournalist, correspondent for Al Jazeera Mubashir. Another journalist, Bayan Abu Sultan, was injured. And this is just one of the attacks. There was another bombing, of a building in central Gaza, which killed 7 members of the same family, 2 parents, 2 siblings, 3 grandchildren, part of the wiping out of bloodlines that we've seen from the beginning. Khan Yunis is being hit very hard. The Israeli military says its paratroopers brigade is expanding ground operations there. We're seeing that as well in eastern parts of Gaza City. Displacement orders continue to come down from the Israeli military. If you look at a map of what's, almost the entirety of the Gaza Strip is a so-called red zone, either in a combat zone, a so-called combat zone, or under displacement orders. So it's a really dire situation, and we're trying to follow it as closely as possible. But it's all happening, I think, as the world is largely looking away.
Yeah, and Sharif, to offer more analysis on this, we're joined now by really one of the sharpest analysts that has emerged over this past nearly 2-year period. I'm talking about Jehad Abusalim, co-editor of Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire. He's also the executive director of the Institute for Palestine Studies in the United States. Jehad, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy.
So, I know you monitor the Israeli and Hebrew media closely, and I want to ask you about some of what has been said, and to put it in context, what Sharif is talking about also with these massacres that we're seeing. Part of the narrative, there's sort of a competing narrative coming from the IDF, from the Israeli occupation forces. On the one hand, we've seen a number of pronouncements that they're saying that the war is almost won in Gaza, that they have fully destroyed 3 of the 5 Al-Qassam battalions that they had identified in the immediate aftermath of October 7th as operating in the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, you have mobilization of more Israeli ground forces coming in. So it seems as though there are 2 propaganda factors at play. One is the idea that maybe they're preparing the groundwork to claim some sort of victory if Trump does compel Netanyahu to agree to a so-called ceasefire, or on the other hand, that they're preparing people for, we're going to go in and even escalate further our mass slaughter of Palestinians under the auspices that, we're destroying the remnants of Al-Qassam brigades and Soraya al-Quds. Talk about how you see this component in the context of just the unending slaughter that's being unleashed now on Palestinians.
I don't think the military factor is what is the main factor behind decision making when it comes to the continuation of the genocide in Gaza. This is at this point, it's a purely political question, in the sense that There is the question of the survival of the current coalition in Israel, and by extension, the political survival of Benjamin Netanyahu. A lot is happening on that front, especially after Israel launched its war on Iran, with Netanyahu's trial being they decided on a date, and then they had to postpone it under pressure from President Trump, in light of certain regional events that we are yet to know what they are. But again, this is, Israel has announced many times that it had defeated and dismantled this or that brigade. Israel has declared victory in parts of the Gaza Strip, like Jabalia, for example, in the early months of the genocide. And if we, set aside the fact that in its nature, this war that Israel is launching in Gaza, it's not just meant to engage the factions there and achieve military victory over them. When Israel conquers or occupies certain neighborhoods or communities, as we are seeing now in Rafah, Israel deploys contractors, construction companies, and begins a large-scale process of flattening entire neighborhoods, something that has nothing to do with the logic of a counterinsurgency, and any of these types of considerations that you would think would apply to this situation. So this is a political campaign in its nature that has to do with, number one, not just the survival of the coalition. I don't want to be reductive and make this about Netanyahu wanting to save his political career. It has to do with what the Israeli political leadership, those who are now in decision-making spots in Israel, in how they see the future of Gaza as a region, as a place with people, as cities, towns, and villages. And I believe, and this has been said multiple times, and even someone like Dr. Norman Finkelstein has said it. What Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip, aside from the narrow coalition considerations, or the tension between the political and the military institutions, Israel is dismantling the Gaza Strip as a geographic entity, as a population center. It's making sure that the Gaza Strip is rendered uninhabitable, regardless of what arrangement will be reached in the coming weeks or months. Israel wants to ensure that it's setting the stage for the mass expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, whether as a singular spectacular event that it's been trying to push for the past months, with starvation and constant bombardment and the murder, the killing, the incineration of nearly 100 people a day. Israel has been hoping through this operation, which, by the way, failed in achieving its goal of Operation Gideon's Chariots, which failed in achieving one of its objectives of pushing the majority of the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip all the way down to an area in Rafah that Israel falsely designated as a humanitarian zone in preparation for a large expulsion event towards the Sinai. This did not happen, but still, I believe that when Israel is systematically destroying and dismantling any sign of life, any foundation of society, any capacity for the people there to resume their life as a collective, destroying their institutions, their hospitals, their schools, their historic heritage sites, and so on. By doing that, even if we reach a ceasefire, which I know we will discuss later on during the show, even if we reach a ceasefire, we are going to look at a population that has been deeply hurt, that has endured plenty of hardship. And the goal then for Israel, which is something that Itamar Ben-Gvir talked about even yesterday, what he calls, the need for encouraging voluntary migration. There is no such a thing as voluntary migration when you destroy entire cities and villages and render an entire place like the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. This is no longer voluntary. You are setting the stage. You're creating the conditions for people to, be forced later to seek a better life somewhere else. And of course, Palestinians in Gaza are aware of that. They know that. Neighboring Arab states, despite their flaws, they're aware that this is Israel's plan. And that's the situation. We're looking at a situation where Israel is creating the conditions for making it impossible for life as people knew it in the Gaza Strip to be resumed. Now, of course, Palestinians in Gaza are resourceful, they're capable, and they are survivors. Once if the genocide pauses and a little bit of aid and support enters Gaza, Palestinians will show the world that they're capable of rebuilding and of healing. But again, this is about what Israel's goals are, and these are Israel's goals: expulsion, displacement, and the complete destruction of the Gaza Strip.
Jehad, I wanted to ask you more about this ethnic cleansing campaign, this plan to expel Palestinians from Gaza, and how it's manifested over the past few months. We saw after the end of the so-called first phase of the ceasefire, which Israel violated every day, but nevertheless, the heaviest parts of the bombing by Israel were stopped for a period. But one day after that first phase expired, Israel instituted a blockade. This was March 2nd, that grew into the longest total full spectrum blockade on the Gaza Strip of this 2021 month genocidal assault. And eventually, on May 27th, despite major condemnation by the United Nations and all major NGO groups and humanitarian organizations around the world, a trickle of aid was let in by what's called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in an Israeli and US-backed scheme, where we have now 3 distribution hubs, so-called distribution hubs in Rafah, in an area that has been completely flattened, and 1 in Wadi Gaza. And we've seen at least 600 Palestinians, starving Palestinians who are forced to go to these sites knowing that they'll probably be shot at, but have no choice to try and go get aid. 600 of them have been killed. We just seen today, actually, over 170 humanitarian organizations and NGOs, including some of the world's largest, like Amnesty International and Oxfam, have issued a report called Starvation or Gunfire, Not a Humanitarian Response, and calling for an immediate end to this so-called aid distribution scheme in Gaza that's overseen by the GHF. This is a group that is a shadowy group that's being funded by the United States now to the tune of $30 million, possibly every month going forward. And there's also, so Palestinians have been being killed at these sites. There's also a trickle of aid that is being allowed in, an even smaller amount. Some UN trucks are being allowed in. And Israel has not allowed the UN or other humanitarian groups to help organize this aid or Palestinians on the ground. And so we're seeing a lot of chaotic scenes as these trucks come in, and Israeli troops opening fire on Palestinians there. About 70% of Palestinians killed in aid massacres were killed at GHF sites, and 30% at these UN trucks where they're waiting for aid to come in. And we reported last week on an initiative by influential clans and tribes and community leaders in Gaza who joined forces to launch an initiative to protect the aid convoys. They were very successful in securing a rare shipment of dozens of aid trucks that did come through. And they passed through without these chaotic scenes. They protected the aid trucks to let them get to UN warehouses where they were then distributed. Of course, the response by the Israeli government was that this was Hamas taking over and stealing the aid, and that they needed to respond somehow. So if you could just talk about what the effect of this whole aid distribution scheme is, the response by this association of clans and tribes, and also who Yasser Abu Shabab is. This association singled him out in their comments in a press conference as the person who's accused of looting aid trucks and of working with the Israeli military.
Yes. So aid and its distribution is one of the last or the very few remaining sites where Palestinians in Gaza can assert their ability to organize, can show signs of their ability to organize their affairs and as a society, as a collective. And now that it's been established that Israel's goal in the Gaza Strip is to dismantle the Gaza Strip as a society, as a collective, as a community, to destroy the foundations of its civil society, to prevent it from rebuilding and from healing and from reclaiming its place that it's always claimed in the context of Palestinian politics and in the long history of Palestinian struggle against Israel and the Palestinian fight for liberation. When the goal of a genocidal war is exactly all of this, then it becomes very easy to understand why does Israel do the things it does. If you look at the long list of attempts and local initiatives that we saw in Gaza since this genocide unfolded, you've described some, and there are many other cases of families, clans organizing, groups to protect the aid from the looters as it makes its way from the points of entry to the distribution centers in Gaza City or in other parts of the Gaza Strip. We saw Israel bombing some of these groups, the volunteers who work on securing the aid. We saw Israel targeting some of the heads of these families or clans. We saw Israel funding and supporting a group like the one that is headed by this guy Yasser Abu Shabab, and also preventing any effort aimed at imposing a sense of law and order from reaching the areas where the Abu Shabab and his gang are stationed, and bombing those who try to deal with him. So we're looking at a situation where, like Israel is doing with hospitals, right? Like one would think that in a context of war or conflict, hospitals would be deemed, a last resort and a last refuge for the most vulnerable amongst us. But if we look at Gaza today, all the hospitals and clinics and field hospitals that exist in Gaza, everything operates like on less of 25% of its capacity. And then if you might ask yourself, why would Israel do that? Why would Israel keep bombing hospitals? We hear ridiculous claims and so on. In my opinion, it has to do with the main goal of this genocidal campaign. If you start bombing hospitals, which are supposed to be the most protected and the most respected institutions, even in the context of conflict and war, this shows what the true goal of this campaign is. That is the dismantlement of civil society, the dismantlement of the foundations of life in a given place. So the same applies now to any other attempts by Palestinians to lead, manage, and organize their lives. And aid distribution is again one of those sites. And we've seen what types of examples the families, the local volunteers, the local committees provide, as opposed to the model that is now being offered by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is creating a situation where seeking aid, seeking food becomes not just dehumanizing and a process that strips people of their dignity. The way they set these aid distribution points with the barbed wires and forcing people to gather in large numbers and await the crumbs that they throw at them, but also the fact that you go trying to get food for your family knowing that you might lose your life. This is systematic dehumanization. This is an attempt to deprive those who have survived the past 20 months of whatever is left of their humanity, to remind them every day that their lives do not matter, that they are disposable, that they can even get killed when they go to a so-called aid distribution center to get a bag of flour or whatever these people are offering there. So again, there's like a this is like deeply philosophical. When we ask ourselves, why does Israel does the thing it does? It's pretty straightforward, and we don't need to have PhDs in genocide studies to understand what Israel is doing. This is intentional dismantlement of organized life, of society, of community, and a process of dehumanization, mass dehumanization of people, so that if you're not killing them, if you're not ending their lives by murdering them, you create a human being that is so traumatized and so overwhelmed from what they have been enduring that they would never be able to heal and recover from what they're seeing every day: the incineration of the relatives, the maiming of children, the destruction of buildings and neighborhoods and communities, and and the daily humiliation that is associated with this process of so-called aid distribution.
Jehad, I also want to bring in Abdaljawad Omar, who's an adjunct professor at Birzeit University and a writer based in Ramallah. Our readers and listeners, of course, are familiar with Abdaljawad. He's been on this program before. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Abdaljawad, I want to just fly out to 30 or fly up to 30,000 feet and bring this conversation back to the political dynamic that's unfolding between Netanyahu and Trump. And of course, now Netanyahu confirms that he's going to be traveling to the United States as early as I think Sunday, and there's going to be a series of meetings. There are discussions that possibly Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, may go to Cairo. But as I said at the beginning, right now, these are just negotiations, basically, or discussions between the United States and Israel. Hamas has received nothing new except for the Egyptians and the Qataris floating micro proposals about certain terms. There is nothing that has been delivered that indicates that Israel is at all willing to back off of its demand that it be able to continue the genocide after getting back some number of Israeli captives. How do you see this dynamic right now? I mean, Sami Al-Arian the other day posted a thread on Twitter that I thought was actually quite brilliant, where he laid out the kind of three phases of how the U.S. and Israel handle these things, and the first two have to do with just them making sure that their messages are in sync, that the Israeli-American position is the same, and then they put a demand in front of Hamas in the final stage, and then I would add a fourth. They then accuse Hamas of being obstructionist, but are we seeing that, or do you believe that Trump thinks there's some momentum from his self-declared Iran victory, and he's ready to wrap this up, and will actually tell Netanyahu this has to end now?
Well, I mean, it's always problematic to try and actually predict the future, but I don't think that we're at the end of this war. One of the problems that we're facing, I mean, and Jehad was laying some of that out like earlier, is that when it comes to Israeli policy at this current moment, what we see is that even when Israel accumulates some sort of success on the battlefield, operationally, tactically, etc., that kind of feeling of completion is not completely around the corner for the Israelis. It's as if they're pursuing this kind of total victory that keeps evading them. Therefore, they keep prolonging the war in ways that would enable them to open the space politically for even more destruction, more havoc, for ethnic cleansing, for a lot of the things that we're warning about that could happen or is in the process of being happening as we speak in the current moment, but at the same time that Israel hasn't yet achieved at the current moment. And that includes, in fact, the targeting of Iran's nuclear program, which Israel, and the U.S., of course, Israel needed the U.S. to actually target some of the nuclear facilities, specifically in Fordo. But that means that, whether, Israel believes that, and the Americans as well believe that the configuration with Iran is over, that's something that I think we should not hesitate to say that maybe they don't, and maybe that there is a second round after Israel can get a rest, after it can rearm some of its air defenses, that we might see another round in this war as well. And I think in that process, Gaza serves two elements for the Israelis. On the one hand, it can keep this atmosphere of war going on. And at the same time, I don't think that the Israelis feel that they've reached that kind of ability to close the Gaza file and move on from it in a way that would actually make sense, at least for them specifically, since they raised this kind of maximum of not only ethnically cleansing Gaza, not only destroying Gaza, but also reaching whatever total victory means in the eyes of the Israeli political system and its military at this current moment. So we see Israelis being so high on some of the successes on the one hand, on the second hand, being very fragile in front of this non-completion of what they see as their programmatic end to the Palestinian question, a decisive end. And of course, that doesn't only include Gaza, because if they do want to end the Palestinian question, they would need to end the Palestinians everywhere. That includes as well in the West Bank. So this idea of prolonging the war serves at least opening the space for eating more land, annexing more, destroying more camps in the West Bank, creating space for different tactical, operational, and of course, as Jehad laid out, destroying civic life in the Gaza Strip.
Abdaljawad, I wanted to ask you about what's been happening in the West Bank, often overlooked as the genocide continues in Gaza. But we've really seen a ramping up of raids by the Israeli military in places like El Khalil, Hebron, and Nablus, and places around Ramallah and in Ramallah. We're seeing settlers rampaging, burning homes, burning cars, attacking Palestinians across the West Bank. We've seen the largest displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967, with something like over 45,000 people being displaced. The Jenin refugee camp destroyed and occupied by the Israeli military now, as well as in Tulkarm. And no kind of signs of those people being able to return. They're already refugees from 1948, and there's talk now of the Palestinian Authority building them caravans for them to kind of be permanently redisplaced in the north. But can you talk a little bit about what's happening there, the role of the PA? And we also just saw yet another prisoner die in Israeli custody yesterday, bringing the number of Palestinian prisoners who have died in Israeli detention centers since October 7th, 2023 to 73, making it arguably one of the deadliest periods in history for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli detention. I believe the number now in Israeli custody is over 10,000, which is double the number before October 7th. But can you maybe paint us a picture of what's happening in the West Bank right now, and also the role of the Palestinian Authority on a political and military level in all of this?
Israel is using this moment of relentless bombardment of Gaza and relentless destruction of Gaza to also carve up a larger space for transgressing some of the norms and actual legal limits that, in fact, the Israeli state itself has built throughout the years in dealing with the occupied territories, including the West Bank. So what we're seeing is, first of all, more annexation of land. What we're seeing is a deliberate policy by the settler leaders, and led by also some of the extreme right-wing militias that roam around, to actually create and provoke havoc across multiple villages in West Bank, specifically in the Ramallah area recently, where many of these youth top movement have been attacking villages in Kufr Malik and Taibe and other villages east of Ramallah, northeast of Ramallah, which have been suffering from relentless settler attacks. And of course, it led to the death of many Palestinians, including 3 in the village of Kufr Malik recently. So we are seeing also the Israeli army entering areas for a long durée stay, destroying camps, taking the Gaza model, but limiting it to specific areas within specific cities, specifically the Nur Shams camp, the Tul Karim camp, and of course the Jenin camp. What we're seeing is also intensification of checkpoint policies, and of course a trigger-happy army composed largely of young men who are more happy to shoot than to actually not shoot, and that's the condition under which the West Bank is living, at least currently in this moment. So intensification of existing policy and transgression of laws and norms that the Israeli state has itself imposed in the past, while at the same time unleashing settler and military violence in multiple arenas. As we see that happening, what we see from the Palestinian Authority is complete complicity with the Israeli state, non-action on its part, and at the same time the inability to even take stance in relation to the Gaza Strip and what's happening there. We should remember that the Palestinian Authority is the authority that actually prevents the Palestinian people from organizing themselves in the West Bank, either through a deliberate policy of surveillance and intelligence and arrest. And of course, many of, for instance, the Palestinians that used to compose the armed fighters in the Jenin camp are now actually in PA prisons, and they suffer also torture on Palestinian jailers, and many of them, and even one of them, have actually died or passed away under duress in Palestinian Authority prisons. So that's part of the picture as well. What we're seeing is this PA authoritarianism. It's crackdown on opposition. It's crackdown on the capacity of the Palestinians of the West Bank to resist, while the larger picture looms of Palestinians in the West Bank looking at what's going on in Gaza, looking at the prisons where many of their sons and daughters actually are in, knowing the conditions under which they live, minimal food, hunger in prisons, humiliation, beatings on a daily basis, the messages coming out of the Israeli prisons at this current moment. And this is only speaking to the prisoners from the West Bank, because even those, Israel likes to fragment us into different geographies and treat us a bit differently. So with Palestinian prisoners from Gaza, the conditions are even worse, which also leaves the Palestinian prisoners in the West Bank, and surprisingly many of them coming out, ashamed of even speaking of the violence that actually they faced, because the Palestinian prisoners of Gaza, who they can hear screaming and yelling and in pain and being tortured in ways that the Palestinian prisoners of the West Bank were not tortured, were tortured heavier and more intensely. So this is the condition. I mean, it reached a point that you're ashamed of, even in the West Bank, of speaking of, a new martyr being martyred in Kufr Malik, because, the conditions in Gaza are so severe that the demand from us to be, in silence and humble in terms of having this intense geography of pain, of destruction, of genocide, in comparison to what's going on in the West Bank. So this is the picture. I mean, Israel, since this is the start of, this genocidal war that has been launching, has decided that the way it will flaunt its power, not only in front of Palestinian eyes, because we've known this. I mean, Palestinians have always violence of Israel, but they always kept it largely secret. You would be arrested, they would beat you up, they would torture you, but it would still be in secret dungeons. What now is Israel doing is that saying, I'm going to do it out in the open. No one will stop me. My allies and friends in the US and Canada and the UK and everywhere across the world will still support me, will send me arms, and I will keep this form of obscene, sadistic genocide going on. And I will say I can get away with it because I am, a sovereign, exceptional state that nobody can touch. That's the idea, and this is what the Palestinians, at least in the West Bank and of course in Jerusalem and in 1948, are viewing with a lot of concern, because we all know that even if Israel succeeds in Gaza and the Palestinians in Gaza end up being cleared from that geography, that the other geography in turn to be also, or to face a reckoning state that we live under.
Jehad, I wanted to ask you a related question to this, which is, when Trump in his first term tried to float this idea of the deal of the century, which basically would have resulted, if Trump had gotten his way, in a really tiny pseudo state that wouldn't have actually been a state, and it would have just completely formalized the Israeli annexation of basically almost the entirety of Palestine. However, there were indications from that first term that Trump seems to like in some way, and unfortunately these things actually matter, Mahmoud Abbas. Even though Abbas is extraordinarily unpopular among Palestinians, it did seem like Trump had some form of affinity for him. And there are indications that one factor at play may be an attempt to circumvent Hamas in quote unquote resolving Gaza by making some kind of a deal with Abbas, even though Fatah has not been participating in the intra-Palestinian dialogues, the position papers, the meetings that have taken place. It does seem like there's a possibility there that Trump would try to use Abbas's formal position as a way to circumvent Hamas. But I wanted to ask you about this relationship between the West Bank and Gaza, the question of the future of Palestine, and how you see all of these dynamics at play. What we're hearing from Netanyahu about what he may or may not be willing to do, what Trump is sort of messaging is his priority, if we can even discern that, and then the relationship between the resistance factions and the resistance parties in Palestine and Abbas, and how that may play into whatever concoction Trump and Netanyahu try to cook up in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the question of Palestinian national unity, regardless of what we think of this or that faction or player, is the issue has been always the case that no matter what Palestinians present, Israel will always have a reason to use what Palestinians do as an excuse to get itself even out of the internationally imposed diplomatic process. So whether Palestinians reach national reconciliation agreements like they did multiple times in the past, trying to bridge their differences, Fatah and Hamas, Abbas and Hamas's leadership and others, Israel usually would say that it can't negotiate or engage diplomatically with a Palestinian body politic that is unified because it includes Hamas. But when and due to the pressure that is put on Palestinians to that would eventually lead to the failure of these efforts to create a cohesive body politic, even within the framework of the Palestinian Authority, and even within the framework of what is called national reconciliation. That is basically a number of arrangements with regards to power sharing and the adoption of a certain political agenda and a roadmap between Fatah and Hamas. Even that, unfortunately, sometimes and most of the time is the international community causes it to fail because, again, whether Palestinians unite or if they're not united, Israel will always have a reason to say, we can't negotiate with them because they're not united, so they're not representative of their body politic. Or if they're united, then Israel will say, we can't negotiate with Palestinians because the Palestinian Authority would include Hamas, which is, which Israel calls a terrorist organization, and so on. So this has been a pattern that shaped how the United States and Israel engage with Palestinians politically and diplomatically, and this has been this pattern in all of its iteration has turned the peace process or any possibility for diplomatic engagement on the Palestine question that would deal with the bigger questions, with the bigger themes, two states and so on. It made it kind of impossible, and it made it just something that is in the background that people talk about, pay lip service to, but there isn't a serious effort around these matters. As for the deal of the century, Palestinians rejected whatever plan or set of plans that were presented during Trump's first term. And I think, aside from how ridiculous Jared Kushner's plan was, if you all remember that ridiculous map that he presented, I think what happened, what happened after, this attempt to create a rushed resolution for the Palestine question based on Jared Kushner reading 25 books and then, trying to look like the guy who's going to finally reach a deal, which did not work. The plan wasn't serious. The Palestinians, even the Palestinian Authority, wouldn't have accepted that plan. And I know that you talked about Trump's affinity with Abbas. President Trump likes strong men and fatherly figures, but that had no impact whatsoever on the political process itself. So let's put that aside. I think the key outcome that came from this experiment that the first Trump administration did with the Palestine issue is that towards the end of that administration, towards the end of that period, I think American policymakers, regardless of whether they were from Trump's team and later from Biden's team, there was this realization that the Palestinian issue has become kind of irrelevant. And if we look at how Biden presented himself as a rupture with the legacy of the first Trump administration, and he tried to create, his administration tried to create a break from a lot of the policies and the ways Trump handled whether foreign policy or domestic affairs, except on one key and major question, which was the question of Palestine. So after the failure of that experiment, what happened was that there was this idea that no, actually, the so-called Abraham Accords and the creation of this regional Arab-Israeli alliance, that this can be done while bypassing the Palestinians. No need to keep, pushing for a diplomatic solution. No need to present plans, no matter how ridiculous they are. And this is where this is where Biden's push for Israeli-Saudi normalization, giving Israel the visa waiver program at a moment when the Israeli government was most hated by large chunks of Israeli citizens and many of Israel's supporters around the world, when Netanyahu was engaged in the judicial overhaul. So Biden continues that logic, right? Like we can of creating this Arab-Israeli regional alliance while bypassing the Palestinians, and that created the conditions that led to the current moment, to the explosion that we're witnessing its aftermath today. There was this push for establishing that Israel can belong in the region, can have arrangement, that Israel can have peace deals and can be part of this military surveillance, economic, region-wide alliance, while bypassing the Palestinian question. And I think the past 20 months have shown that this is not tenable, that no force in the region can decide on pursuing any large-scale political arrangements, alliances, while bypassing the Palestinians. The Palestinians have shown that they have the ability to not only challenge Israel, but also, challenge the region and ensure that any schemes that are happening at their expense and that are happening without and that are happening while bypassing them and while bypassing their rights cannot happen. And for this reason, I think we're witnessing, with the continuation of the genocide in Gaza, with Israel's bombardment of Lebanon, Syria, and its recent war on Iran, I think we're seeing a shift from that approach, the one that assumed that Israel can establish itself as a force that belongs in the region. I think Israel is shifting now to asserting itself as the region's bully, Israel wants to appear as a regional superpower that can bomb anyone, anytime, anywhere, at its will, as a way of responding to how this effort that started in the context of the first administration of Trump, continued into the Biden administration to normalize Israel, make it accepted regionally. I think this is how we can understand how Israel is behaving and what its approach towards the Palestinians and the region. And as long as there isn't a coalition or a group of states and governments in the region that can counterweight this Israeli drive to become the region's bully, the region's policeman, the region's extortionist that can bomb anyone, anytime, anywhere. I think I don't see any horizon even for those internationally imposed political processes. I think the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank will be reduced to its security roles. I don't think the current conditions allow for any push for Palestinian national reconciliation, and we will only be dealing with this latest iteration of aggressive Israel, and Israel again that wants to bomb anyone, anytime, anywhere, and wants to assert itself as this regional superpower. Will this succeed? I don't know. Maybe Israel will overextend itself, but I think this is the chapter that we're in right now.
Abdaljawad, I wanted to ask you, pick up on something that Jehad just said, or was making reference to, that these so-called normalization agreements. I mean, this is the other track that Trump is pushing right now. They're floating some stories about Syria, Of course, the U.S. now formally announcing that it was lifting sanctions. There's a lot of reporting in the Hebrew press, and we have to take it with a grain of salt, that al-Shara, the interim president of Syria right now, that they're discussing some terms that might involve a formal recognition of the Israeli theft of the Syrian Golan Heights. But the big prize has been viewed in the eyes of both Netanyahu and Trump as Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have consistently said that they would only enter into that process if there was a clear, irrevocable path to Palestinian statehood. But it does seem to be that it's part of Trump's push right now. And I'm wondering your analysis of how that dynamic impacts the developments on the ground in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. And what is your big picture view of the Trump push once again for these so-called normalization agreements? You got to unmute yourself. You're muted there, Abdaljawad.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, I think there's multiple contradictions here. On the one hand, I mean, if you're pursuing a strategy of, ethnic cleansing and genociding the Palestinian people and decisively ending the Palestinian question, then the idea of normalization, while is beneficial strategically for Israel in the long term, runs a bit counter that. I mean, it's not fully counter that, but it runs a bit counter that. On the one hand, it prevents actual normalization from occurring at this particular moment. For example, in Saudi-Israeli agreement, without a gesture of, a road to reach a Palestinian state, some political rights for the Palestinians would be highly impossible. But even if it's possible, the idea that the Arab states will accept, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians into their own territories, whether in Egypt or Jordan, or for that matter, also Syria, would also be problematic. So on the one hand, Israel has this kind of strategic bind. It does seek and desire, and that's where the Americans come in to help it, a sort of political resolution based on some of the operational and military successes that it has been able to incur, specifically in its war with Lebanon and of course the change of regime in Syria. But on the other hand, to actually be able to attain that and garner that, it needs to start winding down its military machine, having not really succeeded in ending the Palestinian question, at least at this particular moment. Of course, it succeeded, for instance, in garnering terrain recognition, perhaps, of its theft, as you said, of the Golan Heights. It would succeed in getting in northern borders some sort of alliance system that enables it to stop spending heavy military budgets within Israel itself in the long term. So there's a lot of successes there, but still the Palestinian question will remain. Palestinians in Gaza will remain, and the Palestinians in the West Bank will remain as a problem and obstacle for an Israeli sovereignty that can be legitimated as foundational without any other claim on the land. So this is one of the problems, and this is where it comes into full contradiction within the coalition politics of within Israel, between a faction led by Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are seeking and prioritize the idea of ending the Palestinian question over any other form of regional arrangement, over also any other, perhaps even regional war. For them, the agenda should be clear: building more settlements, clearing the Palestinians, killing them wherever possible, and making sure that they submit to Israeli sovereignty without any demand on their part for any political rights whatsoever, even if they're minimum rights in the terms of two-state solution or anything like that. So Israel has that kind of strategic bind. I think America leans towards looking at the things in terms of regional architecture, creating stable regimes, not disturbing too much of its alliances with the Hashemites in Jordan, with the Egyptian military, but at the same time would want to also help Israel garner as much concessions from these regimes as possible, and ensure that it also problems that it has. And within that, you see that the only answer Israel has is to continue with war, even if war is not necessarily something that will actually bring about any other political result than the ones that are already achieved in the context of military, at least, objectives. And we see, for instance, the Israeli military coming saying, we've almost ended this phase of the plan, which is basically what they're saying is that we've destroyed Khan Yunis and we've, bombed every house, and we've, cleared that area from any form of, community or neighborhood or built environment and infrastructure. That's what they mean when they talk about, ending whatever phase of the plan and now seeking some sort of political resolution. And as long as we don't see Israel moving from this kind of military perpetual war, towards thinking of how it will garner some sort of political resolution to its military campaign. The question of normalization will remain at least postponed, even if it's arranged before any resolution, or will serve as an off-ramp through which Israel can, start climbing down from, the maximalist policy that it has set itself out to achieve. So I think this is at least part of the picture at play, and I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on some of these Arab states to also concede to Israeli demands, not only in terms of territory, but also on what to do with the Palestinian population. And I don't think this question also only relates to the Palestinians in Gaza, but also to the Palestinians in West Bank as well. There will be pressure on some of these governments to concede to the maximalist Israeli demands for ethnic cleansing. But at least for now, I think that American off-ramp that is being enticed or placed front and center within Israeli political system is not as enticing to this right-wing messianic fascist faction within the Israeli government that doesn't have really a sense of pragmatism that enables it to actually go down that road.
Sharif, you're muted there.
Sorry, rookie.
I don't mean to be the policeman of the mute button, but yeah.
We just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you both a question, kind of a large question, but just kind of to get your thoughts on it. As we've been describing, Israel in the region maybe as a state that can only exist through war at this point, both as a state and as a society. But in terms of their kind of colonial settler ideology and the way they exist, they have had many successes. Syria has its military capability has been completely wiped out. Bashar al-Assad, whatever we want to think of him, was helping to funnel weapons to resistance groups against Israel, and that has now disappeared. As Jeremy was describing, also possibilities of normalization. Hezbollah has been very, very severely weakened with the loss of its leader, the loss of much of its rank and file, also domestically much weaker. Hamas is and its military wing, Qassam, is struggling to survive a genocide, as is other military armed groups in Gaza and elsewhere. So you have this state where it appears as Israel is so, quote unquote, winning and can emerge as, really reshape the regional geopolitical power structure as it did in 1967. I think it sees this as its, second 1967 moment, and can it create a new reality of domination and of colonial control? Or, as some have argued, this level of genocidal violence, this level of outright apartheid policy that has really affected its legitimacy, not only in much of the global south and then across the entire world, but also in its, in the metropole in the United States, where, there's more pro-Palestine sentiment than I've ever seen. So could this be the end, actually, of the Zionist colonial project, a very violent beginning of the end, as people like Ilan Pape have argued? But where do you kind of? Sorry, this is not a short question, but where do you kind of see the moments that we're in at this larger level? Maybe Jehad, we can begin with you.
Yeah, it's as you said. Israel now is living by the sword, and all the attempts in the past to paint Israel as, what it is not, a secular tech hub and that is LGBTQ friendly on the Mediterranean, marketing Tel Aviv as this culinary capital of the Middle East, sending food YouTubers to do, fun programs, eating falafel on the streets of Tel Aviv. This doesn't work anymore. And the Israelis realize that. The Israelis realize that, as I said, the most recent attempt at creating, at normalizing Israel with certain Gulf states didn't really work in terms of making Israel accepted in the region. So now the only way Israel can survive and can assert itself and can establish itself and preserve its survival as the settler colonial genocidal entity that it is through the continuation of this state of war against the Palestinians, against neighboring countries, and on a regional scale, as we saw with the war in Iran. It's really hard to see how this will unfold in the next 10 years. But we know that in terms of Israel's position in the West, Israel has suffered greatly in terms of what public opinion and how it's viewed as a state. And this war that Israel is expanding in the region, it's also being brought to places like the United States, where people are getting arrested, being kidnapped, are systematically impoverished just because they lose, get suspended from colleges, get harassed at airports. There's this Israelization of everything to preserve the entity in its current shape and form. But all of this comes with a heavy price. All of this comes with, a price that, for now, the political, elite, the political class in the United States seems to, be willing to pay. But we're seeing interesting changes, not only on the left in the United States, but also on the right, where with, like certain voices that have emerged that are calling for, rethinking this so-called special relationship and alliance between the United States and Israel. Israel lost Gen Z. There's no way Israel can rebrand after a genocide like this. There's no way Israel can, paint itself as the startup nation tech hub on the Mediterranean that it's been trying to do. So that we know, and this is going to continue to shape how Israel is perceived in the West. And as the baby boomer generation begins to disappear from leading the key decision making in positions of power in places like the United States, we will see much more bolder, powerful voices from the left and the right that will have no problem whatsoever adopting a harsh discourse and an approach to the United States alliance with Israel. Whether this will translate into policy changes, I'm not sure. We shall see. Now, regionally speaking, Israel's capacity and ability to assert itself by force is not something that Israel can afford doing on its own. It needs the United States to do so. So it will depend on like how the direction that the United States will be headed into in the next decade or so. And I think the key question here is: the United States willing and ready to keep sponsoring and supporting this recent iteration of Israel, that is the regional bully, and what that takes in terms of how much money and resources the United States needs to invest in order for Israel to maintain this posture, which is not an easy posture to maintain. Israel is a small entity. It's a small country in the middle of a region that is now that is now hostile to it and will continue to be hostile. And even President Sisi yesterday in a speech, he said that people-to-people normalization will not be possible. I'm not sure what the exact words were, if Israel continues to deny the rights of Palestine. So there is this, even from governments that are not fully supportive of Palestinians, there is this sense that this iteration, this Israel, this that is living by the sword and imposing itself with this excessive force and disregard for people's sovereignty, for people's lives, bombing all these countries, all these capital cities nonstop around the clock. This comes at a price, and Israel will eventually overextend itself, because it's true, they have advanced technologies and state-of-the-art military capabilities, but what is the price of maintaining this? What is the price of turning Israel into this pseudo empire in the region that is involved in this massive effort to preserve this posture? It's going to be very costly and very expensive, and it will eventually lead to overreach and overextension. And when that happens, I believe that the project will begin to hopefully crumble from within. And I still have faith in the region, despite all of the depressing signs we're seeing. But I still have faith in the people. I don't think the people of the region will let this genocide go. This genocide will have major repercussions in the coming decade that we are yet to see. Like 48 changed the political landscape of the Arab world in ways that nobody could have imagined in 47 or 46. This genocide will also create changes that we are probably unable to comprehend at the current moment. But things will change. Things will not remain the same. And the next decade will be definitely difficult, bloody, but it will not. We will not have more of the same.
Abdaljawad, Omar will give you the last word here.
Look, I think that in terms of how Israel is actually framing its successes, I mean, I did, when you're grounded in what has happened, Israeli military has historically been able to create operational success. And we can see that clearly, for instance, in the case of Lebanon, where, the assassination of command and control, the Hezbollah military apparatus was significant, But I think Israel thinks it has succeeded. For instance, at least on the level of, the axis of resistance, Syria was already, a weak resistance. It was corrupt. It had a lot of problems. It was more costly to sustain and maintain, at least if you want. And it wasn't an Israeli success that actually made it possible. Of course, Israeli, hammering hard on Hezbollah opened up some space for the Syrian rebels within Idlib to actually create that condition. But it wasn't an Israeli success purely. I mean, it was this kind of internal civil conflict that has been going on for 10 years that opened that success. But of course, Israel kind of attributes that success to itself. At the same time, when it comes to Hezbollah is not finished. I mean, it is weakened. It is surrounded perhaps more choked. But at the same time, it has not, been defeated totally. I mean, there is a sufficient victory for Israel, but it's not a victory that will actually make Israelis sleep at night, because Hezbollah have given up arms. The same goes for Iran. I mean, there is some operational success. The Americans had to interfere. It showed Israel dependency, not on only Israeli arms, but also an Israeli American direct intervention. But still, the Iranians held. And this is important. Even after you become that bully and you're bombing wherever you want, whoever you want, as Jehad said, you're still not being able to actually achieve what you set out to achieve, at least in terms of turning some of the operational successes, the success in intelligence gathering, to some sort of concrete political status. That is Israeli problem at this current moment. And that also applies to some extent to the Gaza Strip, despite the destruction of the whole strip and infrastructure and the homes of people. Until now, the people remain. And until now, Israel is paying a heavy price, with soldiers being killed. Only this month, around 20 soldiers, I think, or 21 soldiers have already been killed in the Gaza Strip in this kind of long attritional war that is being sustained. So despite a lot of these successes, the question remains, how do you turn some of these successes into a political currency? And it doesn't seem that in Israel there's that old Zionist, if you want, pragmatism that defined its early years, where ethnic cleansing would Israeli leaders knew when to give up, when to back down, when to create that maneuvering space politically to ensure that their, this ethno-Jewish state remains. And this is, I think, where, Jehad's argument around, overextension is important, on the fact that after using all of this power and force and violence, what is the political outcome of that? It remains, I think, questionable at best for Israelis. And I think that will come back to haunt them, not only because they're losing the public opinion in the West, not only because they're losing a lot of the young generations, not only because we're seeing fractures. I mean, somewhere like the United States, where there was an actual Zionist hegemony over, if you want, the collective imagination of the American public, now questioning that relationship, displacing, if you want, the centrality of Israel, I think is significant. We see the implosion of the institution under the weight of their own excess, and Zionist, attack or overextension of attacks against anyone who speaks or critiques or, accusing them of anti-Semitism, that kind of overproduction that will also create, I think, a lot of problems for Israel in the future. So I think Israel has a terminal crisis. It's a crisis of legibility, at least in the world, a crisis of legitimacy as well, ideologically. And we should remind the world that Israel is a dependent colony. It could not have gone through this war without the full military and political backing coming from London and Washington and other major capitals of the West. It needed the arm. It doesn't have a significant industrial base of its own to actually produce these weapons, to produce these aircrafts, or to produce much of the munition that it actually sent to Gaza and Lebanon and Iran and other places across the region. And that significantly, that crisis of legitimacy is important. But also there's signs of also internal problems for Israel, where the liberal Ashkenazi elite that usually safeguarded Israel, that built it economically and politically and set up the system, is facing a faction from right-wing religious zealots who want to change the character of the state, and actually taking, through the course of the war, that policy of changing the character of state, launching attacks against the legal institutions, launching attacks against, the parliamentary oversight of the government, to ensure that not only Netanyahu remains of power, this one persona, but to ensure that Israel also changes the character in the future, where also much of this liberal, if you want, Zionist space that still believes in apartheid and ethnic cleansing, but this liberal Zionist space starts to shrink and starts to have also a crisis of its own. And I think these are also problems for Israel in the coming years. I don't see them, dissipating anytime soon, and that's why war seems an answer perpetually, at least political and military leadership in Israel itself. So, having said that, that doesn't mean that, of course, Israel is on its way to end or not end. That really depends, and it continues on people's movement, on making sure that politicians are held accountable, on making sure that we, as well, Palestinians, continue to fight. This is a lot of contingencies here, because if Israel gets away with this without any kind of pushback from the world, of course, not only outside of Palestine, but also within Palestine, of course, that could be the success that Israel actually yearned for.
All right, we're going to have that be the last word. Abdaljawad Omar, adjunct professor at Birzeit University and a writer based in Ramallah, as well as Jehad Abusalim, co-editor of Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire, also the executive director of the Institute for Palestine Studies in the United States. Thank you both very much for being with us here at Dropsite News. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our podcast feed by searching for Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. We do this every Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. You can watch it live on our feed on X or our YouTube channel or at dropsitenews.com. Also, leave us a rating or a review or a comment. It helps other people to find us and to broaden the reach of these programs. If you want to support our work, as always, you can subscribe to Dropsite News dropsitenews.com. It's free. We don't put anything behind a paywall, but if you become a voluntary paid subscriber, it helps to fund our journalism. It's also a 501c3 tax deductible donation. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms. Tell your friends and even your foes about our work. On behalf of Sharif, Abdel, Kouddous, the whole team at Dropsite News, and myself, I want to thank you very much for your support, for having our back, and for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill. Thanks so much.